Spotlight is proudly sponsored by HEC Media, St. Louis's home for arts, education, and culture.
Today on Spotlight, meet a radio DJ who became an important figure advocating for representation. Plus, an enslaved seamstress who bought her freedom and then became a dressmaker at the White House. And then a book examining the historic contributions of Black chefs. But first, meet some Missourians who played a major role in shaping history and culture. It's Sunday, and you're watching the multiple Emmy Award-winning Spotlight.
For the Wright family of St. Louis, Black History Month is not confined by the bounding box of February.
Black history is every month. You don't wait till February and put it back in the closet.
Or in their case, back on the shelf. Dr. John Wright Sr., his wife Sylvia, and their son, Dr. John Wright Jr., are the authors of Extraordinary Black Missourians, with its cast of characters expanded in a new second edition.
There's so many people that aren't aware of contributions that have been made by people of color. There's so much that's left out of history. To suit a particular narrative, this book helps check some of that dishonesty.
For example, take the story of James Beckworth, a fur trapper from St. Louis who discovered an important pass through the Sierra Nevada mountains, an accomplishment so important it was celebrated in the film Tomahawk. But in the film, James Beckworth is called Saul Beckworth, and worse yet,
He was played by a white guy. So they saw the movie, they saw Jim Beckworth, but to them, everyone who saw, the white guy did that. So you have to make sure kids, black and white, get a true picture of history.
The first chapter in the book is the story of Archer Alexander, a fugitive slave living in St. Louis, who needed a place to hide after foiling a plot to booby-trap a bridge used by Union soldiers. He found safe harbor thanks to William Greenleaf Eliot, the founder of Washington University, who also helped create the controversial Freedman's Monument in Washington, D.C. It was Eliot who convinced the sculptor the model for the man being emancipated should be St. Louis's Archer Alexander. One of the really interesting stories in the book was Kathy Williams, or William Kathy, depending on how you tell the story.
Yes. She was the only known female Buffalo soldier. There may have been others. She got a commission right here in St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks. She hid her identity during the war. I mean, it's hard to do that, but she did. And when she applied for her pension, they wouldn't give it to her.
In the HBO docudrama about the Tuskegee Airmen, a fighter pilot called Hannibal Lee takes Eleanor Roosevelt up in a plane. The story is true, but that pilot's real name was not Hannibal Lee.
That was Charles Anderson, and from U City, who was a meteorologist who did that. From our town, from where I went to high school, a town where I did most of my growing up. I didn't know that was Charles Anderson.
In that same film, that same fictional Hannibal Lee takes out a German destroyer, but in real life, that was Wendell Pruitt from St. Louis, the Pruitt in the name of the Pruitt School, and perhaps better known, the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. Among the lesser-known names is Elizabeth Keckley, an enslaved seamstress who bought her freedom and became the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln. And the list goes on and on. The Wright family are all educators by profession, but they did not set out to write a textbook. It's more of a handbook, really, about using the tools you have to build a future you thought you could only imagine.
I think we'd have more of an interest in the present if we knew more about the past.
I suppose the thing that's really interesting about this is that not only were these people great, but they had to put up with so much more and overcome so much more to eventually achieve their greatness. It's amazing that any of them succeeded.
But it's a good story to tell kids. You see what they did and all the obstacles they had to overcome, you can do the same thing. You don't have half the battle to fight that they had. So you can do it. We'll see you at the top. Come on, let's go.
For more St. Louis stories, subscribe to the HEC YouTube channel. Connect STL from HEC Media. History Spotlight, brought to you by HEC Media and the Missouri Historical Society.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jody Sowell, president of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, and this is History Spotlight. In 1965, Bernie Hayes joined St. Louis radio station KATZ as a dynamic disc jockey, captivating listeners with his diverse music segments while addressing the needs of the Black community. Public historian of the African American History Initiative, Cecily Hunter, explains how Hayes became a pivotal figure in Black radio.
Black radio listeners who tuned into St. Louis radio station KATZ in 1965 would hear the smooth, captivating voice of Bernie Hayes, a new disc jockey who had just arrived from the West Coast. Born to John and Alberta Missouri Burns in Florida in 1935 and raised in Chicago, Hayes graduated from the University of Illinois and served in the U.S. Air Force in Korea and Alaska. It was during this time in the military that he developed an interest in radio and began announcing with the Armed Forces radio services. Before landing in St. Louis, he was a radio broadcaster in Louisiana, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Honing his skill to meet the needs of the Black community, Hayes crafted his segment to stimulate the minds of his viewers with music and knowledge. His style was so dynamic that listeners believed that there were two Bernie Hayeses because of the two completely different sounds that graced the airwaves, with R&B and rock and roll in the afternoon and jazz during the midnight segment. Fans sent complimentary letters to Hayes, with one person actually writing, "You have a perfect blend of music, vocal, and instrumental combined together. You also have original taste in playing music back to back, which seems to go together, all following telling a story." In his book, The Death of Black Radio, A Personal Perspective, the story of America's Black radio personalities, Hayes explores the power of Black music and culture, which led to a rapid change that has since dominated the market and made significant gains for non-Black radio professionals. As different Black radio personalities emerged and dedicated themselves to entertaining, educating, and enlightening their audiences, there was direct resistance to authentic Black voices. To dampen and censor their voices, Black announcers were pulled from radio stations and replaced with white announcers. In 1972 and 1977, Hayes and a few of his colleagues led protests that paved the way for many local Black-owned radio stations and their Black employees. With this picket, Hayes declares, "We changed the culture of radio for African American disc jockeys and announcers at KKSS, KWK, KATZ, and Magic 108. Among his many business ventures, he opened Music World Records in Alton, Illinois. Thanks to the influences of Alton native Luther Ingram, the artist best known for "If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right." Ingram noted there wasn't a record store in Alton for Black people, so Hayes found a location on Bell Street where he began to sell soul music. At this point, Hayes also became involved in record distribution. In addition, he has twice had a regular column in the St. Louis American, with the second column running about 25 years. He is also curator of the Wolf Jazz Institute at Harris Stowe State University and founder of the National Black Radio Hall of Fame. Immersed in current events and his community, Hayes has focused on vital topics to transform Black life. His career as a radio broadcaster, announcer, disc jockey, and columnist has brought him into the homes of many and made him a key figure in the Black community.
Next week on History Spotlight, how a non-migratory European bird species found its home in the middle of North America.
To learn more about the Missouri Historical Society, visit mohistory.org.
HEC Media. Recognized, celebrated, honored time and again for excellence in the industry. Find all of the award-winning content at hecmedia.org.
Well, Elizabeth Keckley was an enslaved woman who lived in St. Louis in the late 1840s. She is known in history as a dressmaker to both Verena Howell Davis, who was Jefferson Davis's wife, president of the Confederacy, and then she became dressmaker to Mary Todd Lincoln during the Lincoln administration. So she was a very well-respected dressmaker in her lifetime.
Of course, she was known as a modiste, that she designed and made clothes. And if she were alive today, she would have been a couture designer. That's just how skillful she was.
She was born into slavery, of course. She endured many hardships as she was growing up, and including all manner of abuse. Growing up as an enslaved woman, she was expected to mend things and produce clothing. She had a natural talent for it. And beyond that, she was also educated in she could read and write, which was something that was forbidden by law for African Americans. So she was lucky in that aspect as well. She was educated and she had this natural skill.
And so when her original owner died, Armistead Burwell, he left Elizabeth and her mother to his daughter. Her daughter had married a man by the name of Hugh Garland.
Hugh Garland was an attorney from Virginia. He was not a particularly successful attorney. Even according to Keckley in her own autobiography, talks about how he was not very good at business, not very good taking care of himself and his family financially.
So he decided he was going to come to St. Louis. A lot of people were moving west looking for their fortunes.
When he's in St. Louis and he is in dire straits financially, he decides that probably the best way for him to make some extra income is to rent out his slaves. Elizabeth goes to Hugh Garland and she proposes that she use her dressmaking skills as a means of support for his family.
And she said that for about over 2 years, she had to support 17 people. And her business really kind of took off. Her services were much in demand. She developed a very affluent clientele. She describes it, the best ladies of St. Louis used her services.
Elizabeth had the opportunity to buy herself out of slavery, to purchase her way out. This happens in 1855. She becomes a free person of color.
She decided to go to D.C., and that's when her career really took off. She started making gowns. Of course, she was going to always have to cater to rather well-to-do women. She made gowns for Robert E. Lee. She actually worked for Jefferson Davis and his wife. She had quite a reputation. She got introduced to, of course, Mary Todd Lincoln, and of course that's where her career was really cemented there.
She and Mary Todd became close. There was a certain amount of trust between them. Mary Todd Lincoln was also known to be a very difficult personality.
I think because some historians say, well, she violated the conventions of the time and talking about these personal relationships. That was unseemly.
As compared to now, of course, well, we see this as an incredible primary resource, as a first-hand account of a person who was there in the room with the Lincolns, someone who had endured the horrors of slavery and who had managed to overcome this through incredible means and skill and talent. It is probably one of the most insightful of these types of narratives that we see from this time period. She had a story to tell.
Later on Spotlight, the story of the Iron Riders, why they rode their bicycles 1,900 miles.
To think of African American cooking as simply a modern-day version of soul food is to think of a gumbo as simply a soup. Even while under slavery, black cooks created a distinctly American foodway, one that blends Southern cooking with European and Native American influences. Their talents earned them the respect of slave owners and employers, and that impact is felt still today. A book by Washington University professor Rafia Zafar examines the historic contributions of black chefs. Recipes for Respect is not a cookbook. Instead, it's an examination of the intersection of African American culture, history, and food.
It notes that she was awarded 2 medals for best pickles and sauces and best...
To Dr. Zafar, cookbooks are a form of literature. In them, she finds revelations about African American history, especially when the author is a former slave. For example, an orientation clause, the sentence that explains a recipe, reveals a lot about a cook's life beyond the kitchen.
I concluded to bring forward a book of my knowledge based on an experience of upwards of 35 years in the art of cooking.
That's what I love about cookbooks. You have to read between the lines.
Although Dr. Zafar's book is academic, she is a professor after all. It's peppered with characters who jump off the page. Many of the chefs she writes about were former slaves, like Abby Fisher, whose book, What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, was published in 1881.
Abby Fisher was from the Deep South, ended up in San Francisco, where she's listed in directories as a pickle maker and a caterer. And she became well known for her expertise and deliciousness of the things she made. And she had a group of well-off white San Francisco women who encouraged her to write a cookbook. There's no mention of her background. There's no mention of her race, only that she is someone who, she says in the introduction that she did not have the benefit of an education. And then there are only 3 recipes that either glancingly or about as explicitly as you can get refer to a life spent, if not literally in slavery, in a slave society. One for blackberry syrup, one for hoe cakes, and one for what she calls infant pap.
Take 1 pint of flour, sifted and tied up in a clean cloth securely tight.
And it's actually an incredible thing for a black woman in the South to say, particularly if it was in slavery. That meant she wasn't separated from her children. If she was a woman of any sort in the 19th century, that she gave birth and raised that many children is also phenomenal, because the infant and maternal mortality rates in the 19th century were very, very high. So she's kind of bragging. It's a humble brag, but it's a real brag.
And there is Melinda Russell, whose 1866 pamphlet of recipes is the earliest known cookbook by an African American.
When you read her cookbook, she has a slave narrative, the story of her family prefacing her cookbook.
I was born in Washington County and raised in Greene County in the eastern part of Tennessee. My mother was a member of one of the first families set free by Mr. Noddy of Richmond.
Essentially saying, we were slaves, and this is a good cookbook, because even by that point, the idea that there were black people who were in the kitchen and were sophisticated cooks, great cooks, was already starting to take hold of the American consciousness.
Former slave Rufus Estes was heralded for his fine cooking, enjoyed by royalty and heads of state on luxury Pullman cars. His cookbook was published in 1911 and includes an entire chapter on sauces. And with instructions that could be lifted from Downton Abbey, Butler Robert Roberts' 1827 book was a guide to proper hospitality in a well-to-do household.
When your cloth is perfectly even, then put round your plates, laying 4 at each side. Then put round your knives and forks, placing your knives at the right hand with the edge of the blade toward the...
He tells you how to polish silver, certain remedies like for hangover, but also just how to run a household correctly. And of course, the irony of this is that African Americans were at the time thought of as dirty and savage and all that. But it was a black man who wrote this hospitality book that at least one Confederate general had in his library.
A hangover remedy would have been particularly helpful after one of Tom Bullock's concoctions. He worked at the St. Louis Country Club as a mixologist in the years before Prohibition. In the foreword to the book, The Ideal Bartender, Tom's skills with a shaker were lauded by presidential grandfather and great-grandfather George Herbert Walker. Where does this interest in food intersect with academia? Dr. Safar says food became a fascination in childhood during time spent in her grandmother's Harlem kitchen.
She made oxtail. I mean, things we now might think of as sort of soul food, right? Fried chicken. She always had greens. The thing I'm kind of interested in terms of literature is not only the way a sentence or a story is put together, but the cultural and the historical context. I saw how much what anthropologists call foodways, how much that has to do with the creation of Black literature and how Black authors specifically use their knowledge of foodways to sort of construct a Black literary or entrepreneurial civil rights identity.
HEC Films. Explore, inspire, educate, and entertain. HEC Films, just one of the many facets of award-winning content you'll find at hecmedia.org.
You can find the stories featured in today's show along with past episodes and more at hecmedia.org/spotlight.
It's not often that we gather in Forest Park to celebrate the end of a 1,900-mile bicycle ride. In fact, this has only happened twice, the first being in 1897 and the second in 2022.
We are here to commemorate the 125th anniversary of the Iron Riders, which was a group of Buffalo soldiers that rode bicycles from Fort Missoula, Montana to Forest Park, St. Louis in 1897. It originally came about because Lieutenant James Moss, who was the commander of the group, he was an avid bicycle fan. And he had the idea of trying to incorporate bicycles in military troop movements. It was to test the effectiveness of bicycles in military troop movements over horses. Horses can be shot out from under you, they can be noisy, they require food, water, shelter. With a bicycle, all it is just making the necessary repairs and continuing on the journey.
With a segregated U.S. military, all Black regiments were formed by Congress and eventually nicknamed Buffalo Soldiers. Of these regiments, the 25th Cavalry was responsible for the bike ride proposed by Lieutenant Moss. And so, having volunteered themselves for the task, 20 soldiers who fit the height and weight criteria were given a daunting assignment meant to measure the value of cycling against the standard horseback as a primary means of military transportation. Enthusiastic and ready to prove their strength and dedication in the face of judgment from white peers, these soldiers, under the direction of Lieutenant Moss, began a long-distance test ride starting in Missoula, Montana on June 14th and ending in St. Louis, Missouri on July 24th, arriving in Forest Park to a crowd of proud onlookers. Officially titled The Great Bicycle Experiment by newspapers, this journey took them through Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, and of course, Missouri. This trail was chosen in part because of the varied and challenging extreme conditions, climates, and landscapes that would adequately test the range of efficiency of transportation by bicycle. From thick mud to freezing temperatures to steep hills to excessive heat, these soldiers faced it all with just single-speed bikes and limited access to clean water.
Picture 1897, what those guys did. There's no roads. Okay, it was all mountainous. Okay, they had to ride on railroad tracks. But if people are perceiving a railroad track, and there's gravel and stuff, there was no gravel there. They were just putting the ties down, blocks down, and they were riding on that. They used to run through when it would rain, going over the mountains. It would rain. They called it gumbo mud because it was all mixed up with all the mixture. They had to ride on the side. They had to carry the bikes. They had somewhere close to 50 to 70 pounds. They were a little different. They were one speed. It was really a great experiment.
These soldiers, while bonded through their time in the military, and particularly so while in the depths of the bike ride, were varied and widespread in their skills and interests.
Now, while they weren't riding bikes, they were fixing the fort, they were building roads, they were marshals, they played in the band. They even started baseball in 1894 up in Fort Missouri. Some of those guys wound up going into, later when they got out of service, into the Negro Leagues.
Although the experiment ultimately ended with the military deciding against standard bicycle use, the endeavor shows the strength and courage of a group of Buffalo soldiers who accomplished a major feat. The arrival of the soldiers in Forest Park was a major spectacle that celebrated an accomplishment performed by Black American men. 125 years later, that day is being honored and reflected upon as cyclist Eric Cedinho journeys into town after retracing the steps that the soldiers took so long ago. Cedinho, known by many as the bicycle nomad, took on this great task as a way to pay homage to the soldiers' dedication.
So I retraced the 1897 expedition of the Bicycle Corps. I've always been an explorer and I loved history. So I wanted to know who were the first people that traveled by bicycle. And I came across the Bicycle Corps. And that just inspired me because for the first time, I've seen people that look like me, but that traveled 125 years ago by bicycle. I definitely felt connected with each one of them, especially such a hard trip, physically, mentally, spiritually. There were some times that I'm like, wow, if I would not have been doing this, retracing history or paying homage to these guys, I probably would have left the trip a long time ago. I probably would have flown home before Nebraska. That's how hard this trip was. What kept me pushing was like, those guys did it, and they dealt with harsh conditions. I mean, they just went through so much that I'm like, how can I just give up? These guys paved the way for me to be here. I have a son now. I want him to be inspired by these guys. These are explorers of colors that are not written in books. It's a U.S. history, but it's also to inspire the next generation of kids to dream.
Next week, what started as a travel bucket list became a popular Instagram page and a coffee table book. Plus, what a conductor does when they're standing in front of the symphony. Thanks for watching Spotlight. Join us next Sunday at 9:30 a.m. on KPLR 11.